Welcome to the show, everybody. This is Craig Poster Jardula, and this is LOL, Left on Left, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep from crying. I am the captain, Craig Poster Jardula. With me is the professor, Jeremy Kuzmarov. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
It's great to be with you.
Jeremy, let's get right into it. We have a lot of things to talk about, but one thing in particular is what's been going on in academia in the United States. There's this article out there, and it talks about, in fact, somebody we know, Danny Shaw, but he's not the only one who's been suppressed and has had his job, has lost his job. There are many others. Where's the article? Somebody took the article out.
Well, and I myself, have lost my job, although I signed a non-disclosure agreement, so I'm not at liberty to discuss it. But this is actually, something I think the public should be more aware of. How higher education has betrayed its value system, which is supposed to emphasize, free speech, free debate, to really encourage dissenting and different views. And I mean, part of the greatness of a good liberal arts degree would be hearing from professors of different perspectives on world affairs. But instead, what you have is a regime of censorship in higher education, where people who have critical views of U.S. foreign policy lose their jobs, and many young faculty are intimidated and end up adopting neoconservative positions or just embracing the dominant narrative, whether it's foreign policy issues, domestic policy, COVID-19. Otherwise, they feel that they'll be fired. And students are not being exposed to different ideas. And perhaps even the students feel intimidated as well in this kind of climate. And it's administrators as well as other faculty are participating in these McCarthyite-like purges. And this Intercept article, in the Palestine conflict, has spotlighted what has been going on now for a long time in higher education. Faculty, the Intercept had this article spotlighting how faculty are being fired who are critical of Israel and its war in Gaza. But unfortunately, it's not just that topic. Anyone who's critical of the U.S. empire is purged from academia. People who adopt a class analysis and left-wing positions have been purged for a long time. And I think we've seen a return to the McCarthy era where there were notorious firings and injustices.
Yeah, you wanted to discuss a little bit more, too, as well, about your experiences yourself that you've witnesses. And this is kind of crazy because we know one of the people that was mentioned in this article, Danny Shaw, our good friend. I do a lot of solidarity work with him. I observed elections with the guy, and he's been out vocal about his support when it comes to Palestine. Can you give us a little bit more in depth about what you've personally experienced, the other side from what you just told us?
Well, yeah, I've experienced this directly. I was in the field of foreign relations history. I taught, courses on the history of the CIA. I presented, critical views on U.S. foreign policy to students, and students ate it up. I tried to present a range of perspectives on historical events, including, the affected countries. Looking at U.S. wars like Philippine or Vietnam War, to try and study from the different viewpoint, including U.S. policymakers and soldiers, but also look at from the affected country, the people, the civilian of that country, the soldiers who fought against the United States, and to look at the U.S. empire, the pattern of imperialism going back to the conquest of North America and the subjugation of the Native Americans. And evidently that kind of analysis is not tolerated in higher education today. I was removed. Either I was never hired back, even though I had great credentials. I had very good publication records for a young faculty member. I was even publishing in distinguished journals. I was getting invitations to prestigious conferences in Europe. I had good student reviews. I worked with graduate students. In fact, I had record numbers of graduate students working with me, and yet I was still either my contract was not renewed or I was deprived tenure. And I was up for, in fact, I challenged the tenure. I was subjected to fraudulent reports. When I challenged it, I won my case, but I was still never granted tenure and basically bought off and forced out.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, especially when you see this mass censorship out there, and then the people involved. Is it true what conservatives say about this Marxist takeover and radical control of the institutions of higher education? I mean, even if it's not like a Marxist takeover of sorts, is it some other type of kind of woke takeover that's taking place?
Well, I don't think there's much substance what the conservatives are claiming. A lot of leftists are the one really being purged, and those critical of U.S. foreign policy. On the other hand, there is this kind of wokeism and predominance of identity politics, and that has alienated some conservatives for legitimate reasons. Like the field of history, there was a historical neglect, for race issues and the maltreatment of African Americans and women. And so that was rectified, but then they went too far in the other direction. They're not even teaching traditional history anymore. Everything is about race. Everything is about gender and nothing else. And they're only offering courses on African American or women's history, and they get into this kind of weird, feminist literature that's really not the cup of tea of everybody. And so, many people are not majoring in history anymore because they can't take traditional history courses that deal with political history because that's white man's history. So you have an odd dichotomy where people on the left are being purged on one hand. On the other hand, you have this identity politics. So then there are no courses on U.S. empire, or you're not going to get critical courses on U.S. foreign policy toward Russia or the Ukraine conflict, but you will get courses on racism in America. So conservatives have been alienated in that way. And there's some reason for that alienation. But when they claim that, good reason, but when they claim that there's a Marxist takeover, I don't think that's true at all. Because again, it's leftists are being purged. Class analysis is really being undermined in favor of identity politics. And there are a few courses on things like labor history. I mean, Marxism is rooted in the struggle of class struggle and the struggle of working people. And that's something I covered in my courses in U.S. history. And I was branded as this leftist radical. I taught the history of the groups like IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, and the strikes and labor militancy. And they didn't like that. And so so it's not a Marxist takeover, but there is a takeover by this kind of identity politics and a very narrow type of courses being offered. And I hope students will rebel against this and demand a broadening of the curriculum and rehiring of left-wing faculty, and that diverse views are promoted, including views critical of U.S. empire and views from the third world and global south on U.S. empire.
Well, what about China? Because some of the conservatives will say Marxist takeover, but the other ones will say it's a Chinese takeover, that they're entrenched in academia and they want to get back at us, China, for the opium wars and for, conquering them for so long, or playing a part in them being conquered, that they want to kill us from the inside. What are your thoughts when you hear people blame China for the problem?
Well, I think that's part of the xenophobia. That's a very xenophobic attitude that's driving potential U.S. war to China. I don't think there's any credibility at all to that point of view. In fact, there are a lot of Chinese scientists who were unfairly purged under the Trump administration's China initiative. They were subjected to witch hunts. They were accused of being a Chinese communist agent. These are good scientists, and some were actually prosecuted. Others had to leave the United States. So that's not a healthy attitude at all. And it's not true. In fact, critical analysis of U.S. imperialism in Southeast Asia has basically been purged. You rarely get any courses on a critical history of the U.S. in Southeast Asia going back to the early 20th century. That's rarely taught at all, or how the U.S. tried to subvert the Chinese Revolution. Or when Chinese history is taught, they're rarely sympathetic or supportive of the Maoist revolution. Most of the professors are anti-communist, anti-Maoist, and often quite biased toward the Maoist revolution, which had tremendous accomplishments in regenerating China from its century of humiliation. So I don't agree with that conservative analysis at all. I think those guys don't know what they're talking about, and they're promoting xenophobia.
So we have this type of document here, and it says the Society for Historians and American Foreign Relationships. All right. And it has an article by Rodri Jeffrey Jones entitled "The CIA as a Force for Peace," which argues that the CIA has helped prevent war by giving us good intelligence. Is this the kind of analysis that one finds in academia typically?
Yes, and this is right out of George Orwell. The CIA is a force for peace. Ask the Guatemalans about that. Ask the Iranians. Ask the Vietnamese people. The CIA was a key force and agency in triggering the Vietnam War, which caused millions of deaths. They've been very instrumental in the Ukraine conflict, where there are 12 CIA bases set up, and they basically helped trigger this deadly conflict in Ukraine. So, George Orwell would be very proud of this scholar. And yes, this is the kind of analysis that prevailed in academia today. And if you're critical of the CIA, good luck trying to get a job at a good university or even community college. And there are no courses offered on the history of the CIA that offer real history. There were a few. Actually, there is one that's taught by Alfred McCoy, who's a great scholar at the University of Wisconsin. But he's been around since the 60s era when the Vietnam War opened things up a bit in the academy. I tried to teach that course, and as I told you, I was pushed out of numerous universities.
Yeah.
And no other faculty will they'll try to teach the real history of the CIA and its subversion of countries worldwide and its promotion of disinformation and psychological warfare and propaganda, which is a key feature of the CIA and its history.
It's kind of crazy because you're going to hear a lot of people say, especially people on the populist right or conservatives, they'll blame a Marxist takeover of academia or they'll blame China. But really, to tell you the truth, it's so much controlled by the security state, by the three-letter agencies. We have a piece right here by Hal Brands, a Yale PhD and the Henry Kissinger professor of the U.S. foreign policy at Duke. It's all Russia's fault here, Professor. Putin lies, but never U.S. leaders. I mean, this is just ridiculous over here. They're actually trying to state that Putin's biggest lie is blaming NATO for his war, as if NATO didn't encroach on their border and has all, Baltic states armed with missiles pointed at the Russian Federation. Your thoughts on that?
Well, several thoughts. Firstly, it's what we were discussing last week. Why are there no student protests against Ukraine, only Israel-Palestine, when more people have died in Ukraine and Russia than Israel-Palestine, when this war was provoked by the CIA, by NATO, by the US, by European countries? Well, there's your answer. They have Hal Brand, their professor, telling them about evil Putin. And, Hal Brand has made a great career for himself. It's people like him who rise in academia. He held this prestigious post at Duke University. And, he'd been at all the top universities and makes a great salary and is in the news media. And he's had a great career, and others follow him. And, his PhD dissertation was a whitewash of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. And his advisor at Yale was John Lewis Gaddis, who was an advisor to George W. Bush and supported the Iraq War. And he also rewrote the history of the Cold War to make the U.S. look like the good guy and the Soviets the bad guy, and pioneered an attack. There was a critical school in the 60s and 70s in the Vietnam War era, awakened a lot of people to the ugliness of U.S. foreign policy. And there was a group of academics at the University of Wisconsin under William Appleman Williams who developed critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy. But Gaddis attacked them, and his whole career was to discredit the Wisconsin school and to valorize U.S. foreign policy. And Brands is his protege, and his students spread across. They get all the best jobs. And the Wisconsin school now is dead. And if you promote a critical analysis, you won't get hired anywhere.
So are you a little surprised, Professor, that when it comes to, I don't want to say re-educating people or just giving them the proper education on these foreign policy wars, that it's been a little bit easier to get people's head straight on Israel-Palestine than Russia-Ukraine? Because it seems like the fact that we don't have people in the streets for the Russia-Ukraine situation, when the United States completely, funded and pushed this proxy war. I mean, Ukraine lost its sovereignty completely in 2014. The writing's on the wall. We have leaked phone calls from Victoria Nuland, Jeffrey Pyatt. We have all different types of politicians that are inside, Ukraine pushing for a coup. Are you a little surprised that it's a lot harder to get people's minds straight, especially the students that maybe you teach, when it comes to Ukraine, Russia, as opposed to Israel, Gaza?
Well, I think as we've discussed before, the Cold War ideology is so deeply entrenched and was cultivated in Hollywood for years and years, and I think also in the educational system. And you don't find critical courses on the history of U.S. foreign policy toward Russia. In fact, there was a great book written by the Wisconsin School. A dean named William Appleman Williams, who's the president of the American Historical Association, U.S. Russia relations, that look at how U.S. corporations had penetrated Russia on the eve of the Russian Revolution and how the Russian Revolution was designed to overcome that. But his book was written in the 1950s, and there hadn't been a good book written since on that topic, and none of the professors around, at least the majority, there may be the odd exception to the rule, but the majority just teach the standard line, present this kind of Cold War demonology to students. So the students don't really have the information at their disposal. The Israel-Palestine, I think there was a shift. And there are professors who are critical of the Arab-Israeli conflict who've made it far in academia, like Rashid Khalidi in Columbia. And Middle Eastern Studies department tend to be dominated by professors critical of Israeli policy and more sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. So I don't understand the reason for that, why that's true in that field, but not the U.S.-Russia relations field or the broader field of U.S. foreign policy history. But those professors have reached a lot of students. Now some are getting fired. But and as far as I think, just Israelis went so far, are so far gone that it just woke everybody up. On the other hand, Ukraine is so far gone, so I don't fully understand that. The Azov Battalion is a Nazi force. This was reported in the New York Times as a PR problem, why they're wearing Nazi insignia. They're not denying that these are pro-Nazis. They've committed horrific atrocities, from torture to shelling Ukrainian and now Russian cities, but somehow it hadn't reached people's consciousness as this is abhorrent. And I don't fully understand it myself.
Well, it's kind of crazy. I like to point out that not all Ukrainians are Nazis, but there are Nazis in Ukraine. Just that little disclaimer. But you hear all these conservatives, these populist right people. They talk about how much of a hand that China plays in academia, but when really Israel has a bigger role to play. But yet they seem to be falling by the wayside when it comes to controlling the propaganda piece and the information. You have this article over here in Covert Magazine, right? It's called Harvard Kennedy School of Misinformation. The review promotes its own misinformation. Can you give us a little insight to what this article says?
Yes, the Harvard Kennedy School supported this journal, Misinformation Studies, and it's basically out of the CIA playbook. Every article in the journal is about how they're spreading pro-Russian propaganda, when actually, really, it's the opposite. Most of the media and academia is totally biased against Russia, but any hint of criticism of U.S. foreign policy to them is misinformation. And a lot of it is article about the COVID, people who question the vaccines or the lockdowns were promoting misinformation. And this is what this journal is all about. And now there are academic departments devoted to this. And basically, they're adjuncts of the CIA. And they're not spotlighting CIA misinformation. For years, the CIA has promoted misinformation about foreign governments and countries that have been targeted for regime change or adversaries of the United States. So if there was a real, genuine focus on exposing misinformation, the CIA could be a big target of the National Endowment of Democracy, which is an adjunct of the CIA. But no, it's all about countering supposed Russian propaganda in society. And this, it's not real objective study. The articles I read were of extremely poor caliber. I learned nothing from it. And it seemed this is just CIA agents infiltrated higher education and prestigious universities and are trying to indoctrinate students to be on guard for Russian disinformation and to go along with the Cold War.
What do you think it's going to take, Professor? I mean, you have a lot of students. You know some of these college kids. You teach in Tulsa. What is it going to take to get the kids, the students, to get in the streets and protest what the United States is doing in Ukraine, Russia? I know you've had to think about this before because we've said on this show, like, it's crazy to us, what's going on in Israel, Gaza, and we're very happy that those students are in the street but we're a little disappointed that they're not in the streets for what the United States has done to take away Ukraine's sovereignty. And, not only that, the fact that they aren't saying anything, the United States, policy apparatus, the congressional members that are bought off by this military industrial complex are trying to force through another finance package to go to Ukraine, our tax dollars. What's it going to take, Professor?
Well, and it's not just Ukraine, as we discussed. What's it going to take to challenge the U.S. policy in the Far East, where they're developing military bases in remote Pacific islands for a planned war on China, and they're building up the U.S. military base network in Southeast Asia. And I mean, the massive military budget, where a student, the cost of higher education in the United States has increased by, I think, 3,000% since the 1980s, where the military budget has gone up massively, and the government is investing less and less in education, more and more in war. So, I mean, that should be a focus of protest, as well as the turning over of the campuses to the Pentagon for development of new experimental weapon system and nuclear weapons, totally betraying the ideal of a university. I mean, the students should be protesting all this, but what will it take? Well, they have to go to do more homework. I think a lot of the students I teach, unfortunately, they don't read a lot. They don't read books anymore. So I mean, they've got to do their homework a little more, and they can see how bad things are and corrupt.
Let me ask you a question.
Is.
You also know a lot of students nowadays. Do you think it's because of some woke ideology that might be playing a part over here? The fact that a lot of Palestinians are brown and that the Ukrainians and Russians are white might be a reason why they don't get into the streets?
Well, my own personal view is, yes, sometimes identity politics goes too far. I think historically, yes, brown and black people were often attacked viciously, and nobody cared about their plight. I mean, it's good that people care now about the Palestinian. They care, Black Lives Matter. So I think that is a positive move forward for society. But yes, it goes too far if they only care about Black lives. If they don't care that they're Ukrainians and Russians being slaughtered, that's a problem. And sometimes, as I was pointing out at the beginning of the program, the identity politics goes too far to address historical wrong. They go too far, and they don't teach traditional history, or they totally demonize all white people, and that is wrong too.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the question, right? Are they not in the streets for Ukrainians because they're Ukrainian Russians because the people are white, or are they in the streets because the Palestinians are brown? How do you think it would go if something happens with China and Taiwan? Do you think we'll see the same thing?
It's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, there's a question of, the political consciousness and the understanding of that conflict and the regional history that may be lacking. But I would hope they would care if it's, if a war is triggered in the Far East. I would hope so. Israel somehow, has become this symbol of white settler colonialism, and all the wrath and anger is directed at Israel, and that's a little bit unhealthy. I mean, Israeli atrocities are terrible, but the United States, I mean, kids who live in the United States should focus on the U.S. government and what it has done and what it could do better. I mean, protest movement ultimately to create social change. So if you live in the United States, there's very little you can change about Israeli politics. And the other thing is, maybe it goes a little too far. I mean, Israel is not the symbol of all evil in the world. I think it's become that.
Yeah,
and it inflames some people. I mean, I know there are a lot of Jewish people, but
it does. Well, listen, that's it for this episode of LOL. This is that episode of LOL where the left laughs out loud to keep itself from crying. I'm Craig Pasta Jardula, and that's Jeremy Kuzmarov.